talking about Philippine hazards, focusing here in our country, and how science and technology is used for CCA DRR. DRR stands for Disaster Risk Reduction. Okay? And CCA, Climate Change Adaptation. We have an area of about 300,000 square kilometers land area. And its location is the prime target for hazards. We are in the Pacific Ring of Fire, and we are in the typhoon belt. Climatological effects of El Nino and La Nina and the southwest monsoons, yung tinatawag natin na habagat. When there's a typhoon in the eastern part of the Philippines, it gives vitamins to the rain clouds in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. So parang nagiging mas malakas yung hangin, tapos mas marami yung ulan doon sa western part. And it has caused flooding events in Metro Manila. Here I show you since 1948 or 1949, there have been a lot of typhoons that have entered in the Philippine area of responsibility. So each line that you are seeing represents the track of a typhoon since 1948. So we're just in 1972, counting to year 2000. You can see that of all the tracks, no, if you combine all of these tracks, Mindanao is not that well covered, but Visayas and Luzon are very well covered. No? And because there are not many typhoons in Mindanao, there's less damage to agricultural crops. There's less damage to crops. And that's probably one of the reasons why Mindanao is the fruit basket, no, of the Philippines. And you can see that of all of these typhoons, ano ba yung mga associated hazards? No? The typhoon is not the phenomenon. It's not the hazard. It's the phenomenon. What kills people are the strong winds that can rip off the roof of houses, make trees fall down, and when you get hit, you die. Diba? It's the floods. When pag nalunod kayo, you die. No? That's the hazard. So the typhoon is not really, or the cyclone is not the hazard. It's the landslide that is triggered by the excessive rainfall. Okay? That's the hazard. Tapos, storm surges. You've heard of storm surge, right? It happened in the central Philippines region. Aside from being the typhoon belt ng Pacific, we're also in the Pacific Ring of Fire. No? So all of these yellow and green ones and red areas, okay, are actually earthquake epicenters that have been plotted on a map. No? Not all earthquakes happen just anywhere. No? They happen in specific zones. And in the area of the Pacific, surrounding the Pacific, you have a lot of earthquakes happening. It's based on the historical record of earthquakes. No? And because it surrounds the Pacific, and also because these places where earthquakes occur around the Pacific are associated with many volcanoes, no? And volcanoes are associated with fire. Diba? Yung lava, it's very, very hot. That's the reason why it's called the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's surrounding the Pacific Ocean. No? So the countries surrounding the Pacific Ocean experience a lot of earthquakes, and there are volcanoes. And again, the eruption itself is the phenomenon. The earthquake itself is the phenomenon. No? So the hazards associated with the earthquake are yung collapse of a building, nadadaganan kayo. The ground shaking or the earthquake itself, if you're in an open field, you will not die. No? It's the hazard. So pag nag-shaking, it will make the building unstable. If it collapses, you die. No? So these are the hazards. Other hazards associated with earthquakes are tsunamis. No? So if the tsunami happens, you get buried or you get flooded in your area and you can't swim, and there's a wave that brings you and gets your head to hit a wall, then you die. Sa volcanoes, yung volcanic eruption, you don't get killed, no? Especially if you're far away. But if you're near lava, okay, If you're near the volcanic eruption and you come in contact with lava and it surrounds your house, you'll die from the excessive heat. Those are the hazards. No? We have to deal with the hazards. We know that these phenomena that bring forth the hazards will always be here, but we need to be aware of what these hazards really are. But in order to understand the hazards, we also must understand the phenomena. No? So this is where science comes in. The Philippines is the third most vulnerable country in the world to natural hazards. Name it, we have it, except for hazards associated with snow. Marami tayong hazards, and at the same time, there are a lot of people that are exposed to that hazard. And these people don't have enough capacity to be able to address the hazard. No? Kasi one of the reasons probably is they are persons with disabilities, or they are poor and they don't understand, they're not aware, and that increases what we call as risk. No? So you have the hazard, people are exposed, and these people are vulnerable. No? Parang their capacity to address the hazard is not that good. And therefore, if you combine all of them, it leads to our understanding of disaster risk. One manifestation of that high risk is probably your poor awareness or your poor understanding of the hazards in our country. Do you agree? Huh? Do you know of the hazards in our country? There are about more than 20. Can you name all of them?
No, sir.
Do you know the hazards in this area?
Probably not all.
Probably not. No? So you are college students, no? And if you don't know all, no? So what more the people who don't study, diba? So you can just imagine that we really need to build awareness, no? So as to reduce the risk. And one manifestation also of that high vulnerability and high risk is that we have been experiencing disasters. So these are the hazards, no? We have pyroclastic flow associated with volcanic hazards, pyroclastic flow, debris avalanche, lahar, lava, tsunami, noxious gas, fire, landslides, ground subsidence, liquefaction, ground rupture, collapse of structures, earthquake-generated tsunami, floods, storm surge, strong winds, rain-induced landslides. So there are so many hazards. Are you prepared for each of these hazards? In the Philippines, of all the types of hazards, the number one are those that are associated with cyclones and extreme weather. No? Like floods and storms, these are the blue and the red ones. No? So you can see that from 1970s up to the decade from 2000 to 2009, it's really the floods and storms that cause a lot of damage, no? Because they come in several times a year. No? So in a year, about 20 cyclones enter the Philippine area of responsibility. And in Luzon and Visayas, there are about 6 to 7 that make landfall. In Mindanao, there are about less than 1 on average per year. Distribution of natural disasters, you can see that floods and storms are the most reported. Just to give you an idea of what kind of disasters have happened in the Philippines, this is one that happened in 2009, a massive landslide. The technical term is called a debris avalanche. No? This ridge, okay, that ridge, which is about 700 meters high, okay, 700 meters high, rocks there collapsed and flowed down, no, en masse, and developed a landslide footprint which was 4 kilometers long and 1.5 kilometers wide. And the town of Ginsaugon was buried, no? And that town had a population of 1,857. So this is the 700-meter ridge. It went down. That is about 4 kilometers, 1.5 kilometers wide. And the town of Ginsaugon was buried under 30 meters of rubble. Many people died. Fatalities 1,226, missing 980, bodies recovered 139, treated for injuries, those who died in the hospital 2. And they were trying to find that elementary school, which was buried, supposedly buried under 30 meters of rubble. It was a 2,000-man strong search and rescue team composed of the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marines, Philippine Army, miners, volunteers, 2,000 strong, with people from Taiwan, with search and rescue dogs, Spain, Singapore, Japan. They all tried to contribute. Even people from the academe tried to locate that school kasi there were text messages on the second up to the second day that for 250 or nearly about that number were still inside the elementary school. So they were trying to search frantically for that with backhoes. And you can see that they were trying to dig up all sorts of places because they did not know where that school was located anymore. There was no landmark to locate the school. So they just kept on digging, guessing where the school was. And just to give you an idea how big that landslide was, that backhoe is this one. The backhoe the yellow backhoe is that one. Laki, di ba? So how can you search for a buried school with 200 plus children if the landslide is that big? Maybe we need a little bit of science there. What we did was we tried to go up on board the helicopters, take pictures, and then tried to stitch the photographs and tried to figure out using a geographic information system where the recovered personal effects, and then we tried to put in place and find out where the original location of the school was, or the town. And there was also a GPS point that was available because they were trying to figure out, they were trying to measure the fault because it was near the Philippine fault. They were trying to measure the fault, and that GPS, you know what a GPS is, right? Had a millimeter scale accuracy. So that GPS point was only provided on the 7th day. Why? Because when we asked for it from government agencies, they said that we are not part of government. So they only gave it on the 7th day. So that is where some things need to be in place, so that it can be ensured that these scientific data are available so that during times of emergencies, they can be used. Enough with bureaucracy. In the same year, in 2006, there was this lahar, debris that was flowing at rates of about 10 to 50, 60 kilometers per hour, which cascaded down the slopes of Mayon volcano and killed nearly 2,000 people. Buried a lot of houses, and one characteristic of that is that there are big boulders on top, strewn in the debris field. We call that kind of phenomenon as a lahar. A lot of people died in Ginubatan because of the lahars: Kamalig, Daraga, Bonga, Padang, and Basud. And the reason why they died is because they were caught by surprise. They thought that they were not sufficiently far from the river. So they were here. They thought that they were sufficiently far. But what happened was that the river, that's the original course of the river, there were dikes that breached upstream. So this dike here, that dike here breached, and they were caught by surprise. And they were overwhelmed by the lahars. And also in that part. Now, this is a picture of the impacts of tropical front that hit Iloilo. And this picture reminds us that floodplains, which are the areas beside the river, which we claim as ours, is not really ours. No? It's part of the river. So when there are big floods, the river reclaims this land called as floodplains, the flat part beside rivers. And you can see that the river, instead of following that course, just went down straight. And those are floodplains that were reclaimed by the river because it's theirs. So there was also another big flood event in 2011, Candaba. You can see this Pampanga River, which is about 50 meters wide, or maybe up to 100. But when the floods came in, the river swelled from 50 to 100 meters. It became as wide as what? 10 kilometers. No? Naging 10 kilometers from here to there. So you can see the force of nature. No? Sometimes it can be really overwhelming if the phenomenon or if the hazard is extreme. And no amount of intervention or structural intervention can stop it. We'll just waste money trying to stop it because the force of nature is well beyond what we can do or what we can design. You see, the Pampanga River, which is this one, but the floods really go all the way as thick as wide as 10 kilometers. And then there was the Sendong disaster in 2011. There was a flood. The river swelled. This is a floodplain. They have claimed it as theirs. And when the floods came in, they happen once every 100 years or once every 200 years. But when they come, they can devastate the whole area within that floodplain. And that is what happened in Mandulog River in Iligan, wherein thousands of people died. No? There was this community, an informal settlement composed of about 500 shanties, no? And all I saw was an area full of sand. In that same place, Orchid's Home subdivision, just beside that informal settlement, was this subdivision, relatively upscale. And when the floods came in, it was reduced to a pile of rubble. No? So this is how the impacts of hazards affect our communities. And they happen almost every year. And it creates so much loss and damage, no, that it runs up to billions of pesos. And if it happens every day, how can we develop? How can we progress? And how can our economy sustain that rise if each and every year we lose a lot from the impacts of hazards? That means that we need to do something about it. Of course, in Tacloban, this is the most famous probably of all the hazards because it's touted to be one of the strongest, or in fact, the strongest cyclone that has ever made landfall. That's what it is known to be. And it created storm surges, and these storm surges killed a lot of people. And of course, in 2013, we also had, that's just a month before Yolanda struck, there was this earthquake creating a rupture dun sa ground, and that rupture was several kilometers long, 3 meters high, a wall similar to that. You can see the person for scale, and that didn't previously exist. No, it was just flat ground. This was continuous with this, but when it ruptured, it generated that Bohol earthquake in 2013, killing hundreds of people, and that wall is quite rare, no, by world standards, because not all earthquakes generate such a feature. So what the governor did was he tried to convert that disaster into something that they could earn from sa tourism. Since it was 6 to 7 kilometers long, and it was high, and it was a rare event, no, he called it the Great Wall of Bohol. No? So that's ingenuity, no? Trying to find something, make it a source of livelihood from a disaster event. So we can do that. No? We have to innovate, We have to be thinking all the time to find ways to solve the impacts, solve the harsh impacts of disasters. And more recently, in 2017, we have this map showing that community as exposed to hazards, but this map was not used. That means that we need really to go out there and bring the science to the communities, to the barangays. So, are you willing to volunteer and go to the barangays in Tawi-Tawi or in Marawi or to teach them of all of these hazard maps, to show them where the safe areas are and where the dangerous areas are? We need people to share all of this information. And we try to use all kinds of media platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, like the internet to teach people, but it's not enough. There needs to be some kind of engagement. No? And if they see young people, students from FEU going down to them, they feel that they are loved. No? And they engage, they talk to you. And when they talk to you, they get more aware of the disasters. No? So that is what we need. So if we can organize people to mainstream all of these scientific information down to barangay level, that would be best. There are many laws that are related to disaster risk reduction. NOAA is about, please visit the site. Okay, that's a map of the Philippines. You can see the satellite information, the clouds, the red, yellow, and white clouds refer to rain. So you can see the Philippines and the vicinities where it rains. It also shows the Pag-asa track. No need to read the advisories every 6 hours. There are rainfall sensors deployed all over the country that stream data every 15 minutes. Either you can look at them one by one or just look at the map and see where it's raining. So like for example, if it's raining here, you know that that watershed will experience flooding. And when there's that kind of information, you must know where to go. The red places are areas of floods. No? These are crowdsourced information to validate the simulated floods. And then we also have landslide hazard maps for the entire country shown at high resolution. and for debris flows so that people can avoid the debris flows, those ones that I showed. Storm surges as well. No? So all over the Philippines, the 5th longest coastline, we have storm surge inundation maps. And it's available for any part of the country. Unfortunately, the floods are not yet complete. But for landslides and storm surges, they're complete. So you can plot exposed areas like schools, like where dengue happens, police stations, etc., hospitals, and see whether these infrastructure or these institutions are at risk from a particular type of hazard. Like for example, these areas, they must be aware, these schools must be aware that there's a chance that they will get flooded. Okay? They must know the risk if they don't want to get out in that place.